Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for the MyIBD Learning webinar series. Today's webinar is focused on a very important topic. It's about understanding biosimilars and what IBD patients and caregivers need to know. We're going to hear from some expert faculty on the latest on biosimilars and the role they play in IBD treatment. My name is Alyssa Strauss. I'm the Senior Manager of Adult Education and Resources for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, and I'm happy to be helping facilitate the program this evening. The series features different topics every month, and so when you register for today's webinar, you'll automatically be registered for the series, which takes place typically on the third Thursday of each month around 8 p.m. Eastern Time. As a reminder, our next webinar will be on Thursday, October 21st on ostomy tips and tricks. We encourage you while you're here to check out the website to learn more about our monthly programs and about our presenters. If you look on the homepage, you'll find different tabs that will sort of show you where to go. You'll see an agenda, watch live, you'll see recordings of previous webinars and learn about upcoming webinars. You can also connect to a local support group or your local foundation chapter. And if you do have questions throughout the evening, you can visit the live discussion and there should be a virtual help desk associate to help you. Just a few housekeeping reminders before we get started. You've all been placed on mute for the webinar so we can hear everyone clearly. All of tonight's presentations will be recorded and they'll be accessible to view at the completion of tonight's program. If you do have questions, and we hope you do, we encourage you to type them in the Q&A box at any time throughout the program, and we will be having a panel presentation Q&A at the end of the presenters' presentations. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank our event sponsors, Gilead, Janssen, Takeda, and Bristol Myers Squibb for supporting the MyIBD Learning series. Their support enables our foundation and our partners to continue to provide important education for our patients and caregivers. I'm excited now to introduce you to our moderator for this evening, Parsa Iran Mahbub. Parsa is an IBD patient, and he's also an alumni of our National Council of College Leaders. Welcome, Parsa.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm very excited to moderate tonight's program. I myself have Crohn's disease and switched from a biologic to a biosimilar medication, so I understand the importance of learning more about this important topic. I would like to introduce this evening's expert faculty who will be helping us understand biosimilar medications. Dr. Christina Ha is a gastroenterologist and is part of the inflammatory bowel disease faculty as an associate professor of medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Los Angeles. Her clinical research interests focus on the impact of aging on the natural history of the inflammatory bowel diseases. She is also the director of the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Fellowship at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and active within the gastroenterological societies, serving on multiple committees within the Crohn's Colitis Foundation, American College of Gastroenterology, and American Gastroenterological Association. Dr. Shubha Bhat is a clinical pharmacist in the gastroenterology clinic at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, where she oversees the medication experience, including education, safety monitoring, and adverse effect management of patients with inflammatory bowel disease. In addition to clinical practice, Dr. Bhat also partakes in research and teaching. Thank you both for presenting tonight. Dr. Ha, I'll pass this over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Parsa. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to be with my colleagues. Let's first talk about the learning objectives for today. We're going to be reiterating certain concepts and definitions repeatedly because it's so important to understand the process and the distinction for certain terms as we're talking about the topics of biosimilars. We're first going to talk about what biosimilars are and how they were developed, identify how biosimilars are similar yet different from the reference product of the biologics, and recognize patient and provider considerations when starting or switching to a biosimilar, and really talk about key questions to ask your healthcare provider, pharmacist, your entire healthcare team regarding taking a biosimilar. So let's go ahead and talk about some definitions. Now, oftentimes the word biosimilar is used interchangeably with generics, but it's important to know that they are not at all the same. So what's different between a generic and a biosimilar? Well, a generic is essentially a chemical construct. It's a small chemical compound with actually a relatively simple and well-defined structure. And that's key because it's easily replicated with an exact copy. That's why you can go to the drugstore and get name brand acetaminophen or generic acetaminophen and know that you're getting the same chemical compound for acetaminophen to reduce a fever. These are also stable. You can go to the drugstore and pick them off the shelf. They don't require refrigeration. They don't degrade over time. And the process to develop generics is relatively quick, typically around 3 years or less. And the quality assurance checks mandated by the FDA, they're numerous, about 50, but far less than a biosimilar. So what is a biosimilar? It's important to understand that biosimilars are living protein constructs that are complex structures with multiple folds that lead to the structure of the biologics. And they're manufactured from living cells. That's why they require refrigeration prior to their use, because they're highly sensitive to changes within the environment. It takes a long time to develop a biosimilar, up to 7 to 8 years, and the number of quality assurance tests that need to be done prior to FDA approval are much higher and much more rigorous than for a generic. So in terms of the definitions and requirements, so per the FDA, a biosimilar is a biological product that is highly similar to the reference product with only minor differences in the clinically inactive components. And I think a lot of the concern about biosimilars is the fact that it's called biosimilar rather than bioexact. But there's reasons why it can't be called bioexact that we'll talk about later on. But what's very important is that these minor clinically inactive differences have no clinical meaning in terms of safety, potency, and purity. So the reference versus the biosimilar product work the same in terms of effectiveness, their potency, their purity, and their safety. So for the purposes of the reference of this talk, we're going to be talking about the quote unquote brand name as reference, and then the rest of the products as biosimilars. So the last part before we move on to Shubha's talk is to talk about some definitions that they'll factor in later on. The first is the concept of transition or switching, and that's when your healthcare provider prescribes a biosimilar in place of the reference or the original product. Then there's the term interchangeability, where you should expect the exact same result if you go from a reference to a biosimilar to a reference, and the risks are not greater with a biosimilar. And the interchangeability is determined by regulatory or legal authorities based on the totality of evidence presented. It's not just someone saying substitution permitted, or you can have these are interchangeable. There is a rigorous process that's involved before interchangeability is allowed. That's different from automatic substitution. So when you get a prescription from a physician or a healthcare provider that says dispense as written or substitution allowed. Substitution allowed means that that substitution can occur at a pharmacy level. And that's not necessarily the case for biosimilars. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Shubha, to talk about the logic behind biosimilars from the pharmacist perspective.
Thank you, Tina. I appreciate the background that you've provided so far. I'm excited to be here today. So this portion of the presentation will basically focus on the behind the scenes things that you should know about biologics and biosimilars before they become available for use by patients. So I'd like to take a step back and help differentiate a little bit between a biologic and traditional medicines like aspirin. So kind of similar to what Tina had emphasized before, generic medicines or traditional medicines like aspirin tend to be really molecularly simple. It's easy to replicate. It's almost like you can almost say that it's like simple as like a rowboat. It's easy to replicate. The materials that are required to use it are very simple. Conversely, when we talk about biologic medications, they're very molecularly complex. And so a great analogy to talk about when we talk about biologic medications is the use of a cruise ship. So do you imagine the amount of detail that goes into creating a cruise ship and the amount of work and logistics is a lot more complicated. So to emphasize, the definition that we use for a biologic and a biosimilar varies in that a biologic is a large protein made from complex living organisms through complex manufacturing processes. Conversely, when we talk about a biosimilar, so again, going back to the analogy of the cruise ship, it's hard to make an exact copy of the cruise ship. So you can still contain the same element. You can make sure that it has the same engine. You can make sure that it has the same structure, but different minor aspects of the cruise ship might be different. So similarly, a biosimilar is a biological product that is highly similar to and has no clinically meaningful differences in regards to safety, purity, and potency when compared to a reference product. I like to use this diagram when I talk about the differences and similarities between a biosimilar and a biologic. It's important to recognize that all the elements that goes into making a medication effective and safe are outlined in the similarities column here. So the main similarity between a biologic and a biosimilar is that they have the same mechanism of action, they're approved for the same indication, they have the same adverse reaction profile. Most importantly, they have the same active ingredient, which we know that how the medication works. They have the same administration route, the same efficacy profile, and the same dose. When we talk about the differences between a biologic and a biosimilar, it really comes down to three things. The use of inactive ingredient, which is used to help bind the medication together. But keep in mind that because these are inactive, they don't have any physiological effect on how the medication works. The cost of these medications, so biologics tend to be more expensive than biosimilar, and the manufacturer between the two can vary. So overall, going back again to that cruise ship analogy, it's very complex to make a biologic and biosimilar. So here's kind of some of the steps that I've outlined that would be some take-home points and what goes into the manufacturing process of these medications. So first, the gene that encodes the desired protein becomes isolated. The gene sequence is then spliced into a vector. And so basically it's a molecule that's then placed into a host cell line and grown to reduce desired protein. The cell then becomes replicated and mass-produced in a bioreactor. It then undergoes fermentation and purification to then create a complex protein. Finally, once that final product is made, it then undergoes a quality control check and it becomes packaged and available for use. One of the gastroenterologists I used to work with said that it's kind of similar to making beer. So you have the main active ingredients. So you have your barley, you have your hops, you have your wheat, and it kind of undergoes a similar process of mixing, fermentation, purification. And at the end of the day, the beer that you get is likely not going to be the same beer as what someone else might produce, but it's going to be highly similar. When we talk about the FDA process, it's important to keep in mind that both biologics and biosimilars undergo an FDA-approved FDA process in order to gain approval before they can be available for patient use. However, the process slightly varies. I want to spend some time here on helping to differentiate how that's so. When we talk about the biologic products, so keep in mind that these are products that have just been identified, they've been formed. We don't necessarily know how well these medicines work. And so the majority of the emphasis when the FDA is reviewing a new biologic that comes onto the market is really proving how well the medicine works and how safe the medicine is. So when the FDA is reviewing the process or application for a biologic, the majority of the emphasis is really on clinical trials and safety data. Conversely, when we talk about biosimilars, so they undergo an FDA approval process as well. However, the main difference is that because we know that biosimilars contain active ingredients, which have already been studied in biologic trials that have been shown to have some effect in terms of modulating inflammation and controlling inflammatory bowel disease. So we know that these active ingredients work. And so there doesn't necessarily have to be clinical studies again to prove that these active ingredients work. Rather, when we talk about the FDA process for biosimilar, the majority of the emphasis is really on the molecular characterization and looking at the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamic properties of the medicine to make sure that the biosimilar is highly similar to the existing biologic. So at the end of the day, when we talk about the FDA process for biosimilar, it's really based on totality of evidence. And the main goal, again, is that we want to demonstrate biosimilarity between the proposed product and the FDA-approved reference product. So Tina had already previously mentioned some of these terms, but I want to reemphasize them again and make sure that you're comfortable with these definitions. And we'll kind of explore these concepts again a little bit further later on in the presentation. So there's the concept of interchangeability, which means that you're producing the same clinical result as a reference product in any given patient, and thus switching does not increase safety risk or decrease effectiveness. We also have the concept of extrapolation, which means that if a biologic is already approved for several FDA indications, so for example, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis arthritis, it's possible that the biosimilar may also gain FDA approval without requiring additional studies or additional evidence to show that the medications are effective in those conditions, because again, the active ingredient we know has been shown to work. So I'd like to now shift a little bit and talk about the biosimilar benefits and landscape before I hand it back over to Tina. So when we talk about what the benefits of biosimilars are, the main goal really is that we're hoping to drive down costs, and we're hoping that these will then lead to additional benefits. Because the biosimilar process doesn't necessarily have to go through finding the original protein, testing to see if that protein is effective in managing the condition, we're able to then basically save money on that process because additional studies are not needed at that time. Moreover, the FDA process is abbreviated, so this also is another way to help save expenses. At the end of the day, if the United States completely adopt biosimilar use, then the drug cost that is already being accrued in the United States could be reduced by about $100 billion over the next 5 years, which is huge. Because again, we also know that IBD medications can be very expensive. And so the goal of using biosimilars is that we really essentially hope to foster a price competition. And this in turn will then hopefully lead to increased product availability. So we're hoping that once biosimilars get introduced, they get adopted, that down the line, there'll be more products available for patients to use. We're hoping that because these biosimilars cost less, that it will be easier to argue for the use of these earlier in the course of treatment, rather than using more suboptimal or more subtherapeutic properties or therapies before we can actually move on to using more effective treatments like biologics. We're hoping that this will also increase patient access because we know that if we're able to drive down the cost, then hopefully more patients will be able to actually be on the treatment. There's potential that it can actually decrease premiums and healthcare costs down the line because the cost of these medicines are a lot less than the original biologic or reference product. And lastly, we're hoping that this will then allow an opportunity to help develop new medicines, which we know is definitely needed in IBD. So we talk about the biosimilar landscape, so just talking about in general, it's not specific for inflammatory bowel disease, but currently there are 28 FDA approved biosimilars. Unfortunately, only 54% are commercially available. And when we focus on the products for inflammatory bowel disease, there's only 3 out of 4 Infliximab biosimilars that are actually available for use by patients. And unfortunately, even though we have 6 FDA approved adalimumab products, none of them are actually available right now. So even with the available products that we have, there's a study that was done that used a database of infusion encounters. And what they found was that from 2015 up until 2018, they looked at the use of Remicade or like Infliximab versus biosimilar. So the top line is indicative of the reference product, and the purple line is indicative of a biosimilar. So you can see that despite being available for about 3 years at that time, being getting FDA approval, that the use of the Infliximab biosimilar actually still remains pretty low. And so one thing I'd like to talk about is the steps that are required to be taken in order for a biosimilar to actually be available for use by patients. So first, the step that must occur is that the originator biologic is approved, is patented and marketed. What then must happen is that a biosimilar manufacturer must somehow obtain a sample of that biologic agent to study and identify what goes into that medication. They also must make sure that they're not infringing on any pertinent patents that exist on that medication. Once the manufacturer begins studying the biosimilar, potential barriers in this studying might include that they have to prove the efficacy and safety and immunogenicity of these medicines. So that may be potential bust right there. And they have to make sure that, again, they're not violating any patents on the original reference product. Then the manufacturer can then go ahead and submit to the FDA for an expedited review. However, there's a potential delay here because it takes time for the FDA to review the application. And again, there's a potential that the reference product manufacturer might again potentially cause some kind of patent litigation or some of that sort. Finally, the biosimilar can then get approved by the FDA. However, this then requires manufacturing time, potential marketing costs, and then once all of these barriers are overcome, the biosimilar can then be launched onto the market. So once the biosimilar is launched onto the market, potential barriers that then exist here now is that, again, we want to make sure that we're not having any potential lawsuits in regards to patent violations and so forth. But then again, we also need to focus on the knowledge and dissemination and translation of the biosimilar use and the practice. So once you overcome that barrier, the prescriber can then order the biosimilar. However, in order for this step to happen, the hospital and health systems need to add the biosimilar under the formulary. They need to establish purchasing contracts, and they also need to make sure that state laws are being met for biosimilar use. So once that step occurs, the pharmacy or hospital then can order a biosimilar. However, they need to make sure that the insurance will actually cover this. that it's affordable for patients, that patients will pay the cost that's not covered, and to minimize any insurance restrictions, the prior authorization or step therapy requirements. Then finally, the payment can be secured, and then the patient can receive the biosimilar, but this is contingent on the patient accepting treatment. So as you can see, there's so many steps in terms of getting biosimilar to be available and used by a patient. So before I turn the presentation over to Tina, I'd like to just summarize some take-home points. So biosimilars are molecularly complex medications to produce, but keep in mind they have no clinically meaningful differences in safety, potency, and purity when compared to the reference product. They do undergo an abbreviated but thorough review process by the FDA before they're approved. And lastly, there are many benefits to integrating biosimilars into practice, but implementation can really be a challenge. So it's important for you to recognize that there are logistical and regulatory barriers, and that challenges in implementation is not related to biosimilars being inferior or ineffective medicine. And I'm going to pass it back on to Tina.
Thanks, Shubha. That's a really excellent overview of the complexity of the biosimilars. So it's not a straight line to go from concept of biosimilars to actual application. So the first thing I want to talk about are FAQs. And we know that a lot of people are concerned about biosimilars because it's a new word, it's a new concept, and the majority of people may not have heard of the term biosimilars until they got a letter in the mail saying that they need to switch. And what are some of the factors that are driving the concerns? Questions about the safety of these medications and concerns that they may be less effective than the reference product or the reference drug that they were on. And also, is it really, what does this word similar mean? Is it truly the same active ingredients as the reference product? And this can lead to something that's called a nocebo effect. Some of us may have heard of the placebo effect, where you get essentially a sugar tablet or a completely inactive ingredient, and you think, well, maybe this is the active drug, and I feel better by taking a placebo just because of the concept that I'm taking something different. Well, there's the nocebo is if you get something that and you're not sure that about what to expect, and you're going into it with an expectation that it's not going to be as good, and then you have a worse outcome. And we do see that with biosimilars, but we can prevent that with appropriate education with webinars such as this one. So let's talk about the first question. How will you know if you're using a biosimilar for the treatment? So what's tricky about this is that, you know, if you go to the drugstore and again, you're getting a generic for the generic acetaminophen, it just says acetaminophen, which is the chemical compound. But for biosimilars, they actually have trade names. So for example, for Infliximab, you may hear the term Renflexis, and that is the trade name for one of the Infliximab biosimilars. It's not a brand new mechanism of action. It is Infliximab, but as a biosimilar. So it's always important to look not only to see what the name of the product that you're getting is, if it's not the reference product, but also look for a four-letter suffix after the word. So for example, Infliximab-AXXQ. That four random sequence of letters differentiates the fact that you're getting a biosimilar compared to the reference. Those four letters mean nothing, but the reason why they're there is that allows the FDA to perform something called pharmacovigilance. It allows them to distinguish which biosimilar is which so that they can follow safety and effectiveness profiles over time. So always look for the Infliximab, the words with the mab and a dash, four letters, and that will let you know if you're receiving a biosimilar. So question number two, why should I switch to a biosimilar if my biologic is working for me? We've all heard the term, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, the first thing is to reiterate what Shubha said earlier. Biosimilars are made with the same types of natural sources. They're administered the same way. They provide the same treatment benefits. They have the same potential adverse effects, and they're given at the same strength and same dosage. So you're just switching one to the other. And again, they're highly similar, but highly similar does not mean inferior, because there have been multiple clinical trials and studies that have demonstrated the same effectiveness as well as safety profile to the reference product. So Shubha gave great examples of talking about how when you use the same recipe for beer each time, it's the same recipe, but it may not always be the same product. And I use examples of if a packaging shifts for example, Hellmann's to Best Foods. When that came out, I was like, what happened to my Hellmann's? I always use Hellmann's for my tuna salad. What's this Best Foods? But it's the same active ingredients. It's the same ingredients for mayo. It's just a different packaging. The packaging does not affect the taste or the quality of the mayo. The other thing is to remember, even identical twins who have the same genetic makeup have differences in appearance. So the concept of biosimilarity is not really that new when you think about everyday application. So again, why should I switch to a biosimilar if my biologic is working for biologic is working for me? Shubha brought up a lot of great points about increasing access. So if we increase access through price competition, more different types of infliximabs that are available, it provides more options, more competition, and potentially lower costs. Now, the natural question is, but do I see those lower costs? Why do I care if the healthcare system has lower costs? Well, biologics drive a lot of the costs of the healthcare system. So if they're biologics overall or at lower cost, we have more options to provide to the patient. And again, Shubha highlighted this, but I want to reiterate, biosimilars aren't just given a check mark, green light to go ahead and go to market. They're approved after a very careful review of data, studies, and tests. And the FDA monitors the safety and the effectiveness of all these medications, even after they come to market. They have to check the same quality checks during the manufacturing process as the reference product, and they have to review the same patient safety reports as they do with the reference product. So everything is the same in terms of the monitoring for safety and effectiveness and confirming that it's the same manufacturing process. So I want to talk a little bit more about this term called pharmacovigilance. So pharmacovigilance is why it's important for the biosimilars to have that unique four-letter suffix, because it allows the FDA to monitor, detect, and prevent adverse effects and drug-related problems for each individual biosimilars. Because we do know about the overall safety and effectiveness of Infliximab as a product, we want to make sure we're not seeing differences across the various biosimilars. So they're looking for consistent manufacturing methods, they're monitoring for immunogenicity, they're doing appropriate post-marketing surveillance, and that's why they have these unique names. So let's move on to the third question. Will my routine change if I'm switched from a biosimilar compared to the reference product? And the answer is no. They're administered exactly the same way as the reference product. Same strength, same dose, same storage requirements. The treatment routines and the quality of care should be identical. So same infusion rates. If you're getting your Infliximab over 2 hours with the reference product, it's 2 hours with the biosimilar. If you're getting accelerated infusion over 1 hour with a reference, it's 1 hour with a biosimilar. The pre-medication regimens, if you get pre-medication with antihistamines or steroids, is exactly the same. The infusion centers monitor for infusion reactions the same way. You monitor for injection site reactions the same way when you're at home. Same storage in the refrigerator, you mix them the same way, same treat to target strategy to assess for response, same adverse effects, and the same vaccination recommendations, including vaccines like flu, COVID, and shingles. So this is where it comes down to the question, well, will biosimilars save me money? And you may not necessarily see the individual benefits of being switched to a biosimilar, because it's really about having more competition to drive down costs. And it's about decreasing costs for the healthcare system so that we can have more access to all the treatments. Because if the biologics remain at such a high cost and there's no competition, then the insurers will make it harder and harder for patients who need to be on that medication to get the medications, but also be optimized on that medications. But it is important because some people will say, understandably, but I have this savings program with my reference product and I'm only paying $5 or $25 a month. Will the biosimilar offer me the same savings program? And the answer is yes. And it's very important to discuss these with your healthcare team so you get signed up for the same savings programs with the biosimilars as you would have for the reference product. So the next question is, well, who's going to make this switch? Is it a conversation that I have with my healthcare provider, or do I just walk into my infusion center one day and all of a sudden I'm given a biosimilar? So this is where some of the definitions that the FDA has made are very important to know. So first of all, the FDA allows for extrapolation of indication for biosimilars. So what that means is that, for example, the key pivotal clinical trials, randomized controlled trials that were comparing Infliximab reference product to the biosimilars were done in 2 disease states, rheumatoid arthritis, as well as ankylosing spondylitis. These are 2 conditions where Infliximab is FDA approved. And in those 2 trials, which were called Planatra and Planatus, they showed no differences in terms of effectiveness, safety, immunogenicity, which means the likelihood of forming antibodies over time with the biosimilar as well compared to the reference product. And so they concluded that the biosimilar could be used in the conditions of rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis. The concept of extrapolation means that the FDA, that the companies do not have to do another randomized controlled trial for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis to show that the biosimilar will work just as well and just as safely as the reference product for those disease states, because they already demonstrated that for RA and ankylosing spondylitis, where infliximab is already used. So that's the concept of extrapolation. And so in order to achieve indication extrapolation, you have to have high quality data. And that's typically with a randomized controlled trial comparing the reference product to the biosimilar. This is different from generics. With generics, you do not need to have this level of high quality data. And you need sufficient scientific justification for extrapolation. So what that basically means is that if it's already an FDA approved condition for that indication for that product, then you can have the extrapolation. But for example, if sometimes we use infliximab for example, autoimmune hepatitis. Well, there is no FDA approved indication for autoimmune hepatitis. So you can't extrapolate the biosimilars for that particular condition. So hopefully that makes some sense. And the reason why that they can, the FDA was very comfortable with indication extrapolation is because these products are so highly similar. And the differences are only in clinically inactive, biochemically inactive components of the reference product versus the biosimilar. And the key point that I want to emphasize is that what you're using a treatment for is its mechanism of action. So for example, with infliximab and adalimumab, which are the biosimilars that are available now or soon to be available, you're using it because of the way it works. And the way it works for the reference product and the biosimilar is exactly the same with no differences. And again, this has been shown in multiple randomized controlled trials. So that's the added reassurance that we have, and I have as a healthcare provider, that for my patients, switching to a biosimilar is, for the vast majority of cases, absolutely fine. And again, this is looks at, so this is just a key slide from the Planatus study that was looking at the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So this basically tells us what the body does to the drug over time and what the drug does to the body over time. And the key thing is if you can see in this graph, CTP13 is the, the study drug name for the biosimilar, and INX is the reference product for infliximab. And the key thing is these lines look like they're superimposed, which tells us that the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, what the body does to the drug and what the drug does to the body, is exactly the same or nearly identical between the biosimilar and the reference, offering added reassurance that allows for extrapolation of indication. So let's talk a little bit more, but extrapolation is not the same thing as interchangeability. So interchangeability means you're on a reference product for infliximab, for example, and then you have a conversation with your healthcare provider and you switch to a biosimilar. So no biosimilar is in the United States has the interchangeable designation at the pharmacy level. So what that means is substitution permitted at the pharmacy level without a discussion with an approval from the healthcare provider is not permitted. However, interchangeability at the provider level, when you have a conversation and your healthcare provider says, yes, it is perfectly fine for you to go to a biosimilar, is allowed. So if you're having a switch to a biosimilar and you haven't had that authorization or conversation with your provider, that is not allowed. So what's the FDA guidance on biosimilar interchangeability? Well, first of all, it has to be nearly identical the exact same active components and no minor differences in clinically inactive components. We're reiterating that again. And the expectation is it's going to produce the exact same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient based on the indication. So if I were to give a biosimilar to somebody who has Crohn's disease and they were on the reference product before, I should expect no difference in terms of how they respond to it clinically and in terms of safety profile if I were to make that switch. And if it's administered more than once to a patient, the risk in terms of safety or diminished effectiveness by making the switch is not greater than the risk. So that's a lot of words. What does that mean? So what that means is if you were on the original or the reference product for Infliximab and you switched over to the biosimilar, we should not see over repeated uses of the biosimilar any increase in safety or decrease in effectiveness over time. Now, interchangeability varies by state, and the point of this graphic is again to emphasize that FDA has not granted interchangeability, automatic substitution at the pharmacy level for any biologic in the US. However, legislation is in place, so that may occur in the future, and it's just something to be aware of, but it does not occur right now. So now this is the more controversial question. Do I have to switch if I don't want to? And we understand that Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis is a roller coaster. Many patients have had ups and downs to get to their journey of remission. And especially if you're doing well, it's really tough to want to switch. And this is where I emphasize to the people I take care of is that you're not being treated by the brand name. You're being treated by the mechanism of action. So if it's the anti-TNF that's given as an infusion that has gotten you into remission, and you have a nearly identical anti-TNF that's given by infusion, it will keep you in remission. But the process to appeal. So let's say we want to switch, keep you on the reference product, and we want to appeal. We have to think about what are the risks of delays in treatment. So let's say it's denied and the process of, let's say, appealing gets hung up in hyperspace. And now you're 4, 6, 8 weeks delayed. There's a risk of actually losing your response, flaring, needed to go on steroids or hospitalizations. And the question is it really worth rolling that dice when you may not be able to get that authorization, or that authorization may come at a higher out-of-pocket cost to you? And at the end of the day, it's all about this whole shared decision-making concept that we reiterate over and over again as when we talk to our patients. And it's a mantra that's very important to the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. You have to have a conversation with your provider. There may be certain circumstances. And for example, one circumstance where I may take pause is, let's say, if a woman is pregnant and they have a complex pregnancy, and I may not want to switch until postpartum and after they deliver. But this is an important quote that I like, that I modified, because it originally said, design is not just what it looks like and what it feels like, design is how it works. And so when we're thinking about biosimilars and reference products, it's about the right treatment. So it's not what it looks like and how it feels like, it's the right treatment on how it works. So again, you're talking about the mechanism of action. You're not talking about the brand name. So what are the bottom line points regarding biosimilars? Well, first of all, keep in mind that biosimilars are appropriate, safe, and effective for the same indications as the reference product. The FDA approval process is far more rigorous, and there is extensive clinical trial as well as aggregate evidence of this effectiveness for the multiple disease states, including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Next, biosimilars should not be used if you have a prior history of non-response, adverse effects, or antibodies. So this is not a new class of medications. So if Infliximab never worked for you, or if you had a bad reaction to Infliximab or infusion reactions to Infliximab, you should not be given the biosimilar. And it's important to, this is where the naming, understanding the difference between the trade name and the Infliximab -4 letters is key, because sometimes you'll see this and you say, oh, this is a brand new medication. No, it's a biosimilar. You've been on it before, move on to something else. The same drug monitoring tests and clinical activity assessments are used to determine response. So the same drug, you can use the same assays to check for levels in antibodies. We use the same treat to target strategy. You're still scoped the same way and with the same frequency. Labs are exactly the same. Biosimilars are effective and safe for non-medical switches, but the switch must be deemed appropriate at the provider level. This requires an approval, a discussion, and an authorization by your healthcare team first. Biosimilars should be used in the same clinical context as the reference product, as the mechanism of action is the same. So, for example, if you're newly diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and your provider wants to start you on an agent, you view the biosimilar the same way as you would the reference product. And so if you have disease activity, the question is, which mechanism is the most appropriate to get you into remission? If it's an anti-TNF, your options include any of those anti-TNFs, regardless if it's the biosimilar or the reference product. Key factors to consider are the consequences of delays of care are far worse than staying on schedule with the right dose at the right interval of the same mechanism. The risks of adverse outcomes, hospitalization, surgeries, and prolonged steroids are far worse to patients in the bigger picture. And that is actually associated with increased cost of care, not only to the healthcare system, but also to you. So with that, I want to end by mentioning there are a number of really great resources that really synthesize what biosimilars are, the process to getting them approved in multiple sites. The AGA, the American Gastroenterological Association, has a great website that's included here. The FDA has great infographics that really simplify the process and why it's okay to use biosimilars. And obviously the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has a wealth of really excellent resources that explain the concept and the utilization of biosimilars. So with that, I want to hand it over to Parsa so that maybe we can answer some questions from the audience.
Well, Dr. Ha and Dr. Bhat, thank you for this presentation. I hope our patients are able to take this information back to the providers and have an informed conversation. Now I would like to invite all our experts back to turn on their cameras so that we can take questions from the audience. As a reminder, please continue to submit your questions through the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So for the first question, this is both for you, Dr. Ha and Dr. Bhat. The concept of biosimilars sounds the same as brand versus generic. Is that correct? Is the main goal just to essentially lower the cost?
Shubha, I'm going to have you take the first stab at that because you probably get asked that all the time.
Yeah, so it's not the correct term to use by any means because, again, it's not an exact copy of the medication. So if a biosimilar is not a generic, simply only because it's not an exact copy of the molecular makeup of the medicine. That being said, again, going back to that cruise ship analogy that I really like a lot, again, it's hard to replicate a big complex product. The main take-home point or the main key point really, honestly, is to remember that at the end of the day, it has the same active ingredient. So even though it's not molecularly, it's not an exact copy, it's similar enough. And again, like Tina said, the main active ingredient, what is important in making the medication effective.
So the way that I explain it to the people I take care of is the concept is actually the same, right? So, you know, so we feel very comfortable. Like when I go to the pharmacy and I need acetaminophen, I don't think twice about getting generic acetaminophen. I'm not going to pay extra for the brand name because why should I pay extra for packaging? So that concept with biosimilars and the reference is the same. It's the same active ingredient. So I should feel very comfortable choosing a biosimilar or being given a biosimilar compared to the reference product. The reason why we can't use those terms interchangeability is because the structure of the treatments are so vastly different. So a lot of providers use them interchangeably. Conceptually, they're the same, but in reality, structure-wise, they're different. Great.
Thank you both for that answer. And Dr. Ha, some patients mentioned that they experience different side effects on the biosimilar versus the reference biologic. If biosimilars have no clinically meaningful differences, why and how are some side effects different?
Yeah, so part of that, so there's multiple potential explanations for that. Part of it is the reality is the nocebo effect is there. And a lot of it is how well were you counseled about what the biosimilar is, the data behind it, the safety, and did you have a very clear-cut discussion with your healthcare provider before switching to the biosimilar? Because if you go into it with a lot of uncertainty, you're just inherently going to feel that it's not going to work that well, or maybe leave with an adverse effect. We've seen that multiple times with the placebo effect, same thing with the nocebo. The other is the question of, is it really unmasking how well controlled your underlying Crohn's disease or colitis was to begin with? Because now you're on something different, and now you may actually be a little bit more aware of some symptoms that you really weren't particularly paying attention to because you were doing the same old, same old. So some people, and not all providers do this, but some providers do, what they do is they check fecal calprotectins, they'll check labs, they'll do make sure the scope is up to date prior to making the switch to reassure that everything's in remission. Some folks, they'll check drug levels prior to making that switch to ensure that they're therapeutic. But sometimes by making that switch, we're unmasking that the disease activity really wasn't well controlled, or you really weren't getting the right dose, or surprise, antibodies were there.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Bhat, one patient who switched checked with their infusion provider and discovered that there were virtually no cost savings. When can we expect some of these cost savings to trickle down to patients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the end of the day, ultimately, we're hoping that if biosimilars if we can 100% adopt them, and that becomes the main source of medications that we use down the line for treatment of inflammatory bowel disease, then ultimately what we're hoping to happen is that because the cost of these medicines are way less, we're hoping that ultimately the cost of healthcare overall will drive down. And on a patient level, what you will see is that you actually will have decreased premiums and decreased copays. So we're hoping that, again, it's going to be a long-term effect. It's not something that's going to happen right away or instantaneously until biosimilars become more widely adopted. But once the healthcare cost drives down overall, we're hoping that then the premiums and insurance costs and all of that will soon to follow.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, what I would say is the biologic medications are so expensive. And with each new class of medications that comes out, the costs are even greater. And at the end of the day, it's not to always paint the insurers and the healthcare systems as the bad guys or the bad gals. They have to be able to remain afloat. And if all the medications are so expensive, then they're going to have to start restricting who can get what and how much. But if we can decrease the costs from many of our effective medications, that allows greater access not only to the effective agents, but also to the next lines of therapy for the patients who don't respond to them. But having multiple conversations with healthcare plans, the costs of biologics are going to end up restricting their use.
Well, on the topic of insurance companies, Dr. Ha, can insurance companies force a switch without consulting patients or their healthcare providers?
You know, that's a tricky question, and I would love to say that the honest answer is no, but the honest answer is no, but the reality may be kind of a sort of yes. So what I mean by that is an insurance plan. So let's say Plan A will potentially decide that on November 1st, they are no longer going to have branded Infliximab or reference Infliximab as their preferred first-line biologic, and where instead it's going to be the biosimilar. So they'll send out a letter to everybody and the healthcare providers saying that moving forward, you're going to have to switch everybody to the biosimilar. And then you have to decide what is the risk of switching this person to a biosimilar versus the risk of keeping them on the reference product, knowing that that may be associated with a higher out-of-pocket cost to the patient. It may not be approved by their health plan, and it may be delayed. So there are definitely certain circumstances, if it's really necessary to keep on the reference product, that you can't appeal, but it can't. One of the key things that I learned from an insurance company is they can approve, they can deny treatment, but that doesn't mean that you can't receive the treatment. So what that means is they can say that we're not going to cover this, but we're not saying that you can't have it. So if you choose to be on the reference product, it may end up being at a much higher cost to you. And that's a tricky thing.
Great. And another question. So on this topic, are there resources or ways that if the patient is, strongly believes they want to stick with the reference biologic, that they can, the physician can help them, not have to switch? Are there any resources for the patients or any actions that the patients or the healthcare providers can take?
So I'm going to let Shubha answer that first, and then let's, based on your experiences and the circumstances where you are an advocate for that, and then I'll step in and I'll tell you from my perspective.
Yeah, Pasha, just to reiterate, you said that are there any resources that might be useful in the appeal process, essentially, for patients that are, So it's a little challenging because once these insurance or once these payers decide that they basically want to cover a biosimilar and that's their preferred product, they're going to kind of, for the most part, put their foot down and ensure that that's kind of like what they'll cover. So kind of again, what Tina says, that they're not necessarily denying treatment, but they're saying that that is the preferred agent that they're offering, but that's the specific product that they want to cover. When it comes to appealing, it really depends on what the specific reason for appealing is. So it's a little harder in this area to argue. Like you really need a valid reason as to why a biosimilar is not going to be effective in this situation. And that in itself is a challenge because we talk so much about how the active ingredient, again, is the main component as to what's driving the treatment effectiveness. So it's a little hard to argue against why you might want to necessarily have a reference product instead of a biosimilar. When it comes to resources, I think really the main thing is just trying to customize it for the patient. So really coming up with a real logical reason that's really justifiable. So again, Tina mentioned like one case might be pregnancy. So pregnancy, we have a lot on the line here. We have a patient, we know that healthy mom means healthy baby. And that potentially, even though we have faith in the biosimilar, this is not a time where you necessarily want to take any risk. And so you're going to argue that, we need to keep the mom healthy. We'll talk about switching to a biosimilar after the baby's delivered because we're not necessarily compromising any outcomes at that time. So it's really a little challenge in terms of like resources available. The main thing is that you just really got to find if there's a really legit or a real reason as to why, and you can argue clinically from a healthcare perspective or like from a patient perspective that the reference product is really necessary.
Yeah. So, and my vantage point is very much online with Shubha's. So what I will say is, the best resource that you have is your personal history, because your personal history predicts the future. Now, what I will say is for the most part, I actually am very comfortable switching to biosimilars, especially for patients who've been in a stable remission on a stable dose at a stable interval. So you're basically switching from, you're doing fine, you're driving along, you're on autopilot cruise control. We're just making a quick switch. It's like instead of stopping at a Shell gas station, you're going to, I don't know, a different one, a Kanoko, or whichever one has a clean bathroom. So you're just refilling your gas tank. In certain circumstances where they're a new start to, let's say, Infliximab, and we're not sure, is the Infliximab going to work yet? Those are circumstances where I'll tell the insurers, okay, I hear you. You want to switch to a biosimilar, but we're not even sure if Infliximab is the right drug yet. So let me get them to a stable dose and make sure it's worth the cost for you overall. Because if Infliximab isn't working, I'm switching them to something else or I'm doing something different. And so for patients who are really active and newly starting, or I know I'm going to change them to something else, sometimes I'll tell the insurance companies, it may not be worth making the switch to a biosimilar. Give me 1 or 2 more infusions. However, once they're in a stable remission and autopilot cruise control, then we're comfortable switching to the biosimilar.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that is actually a valid point. So sometimes you can ask for like an extension of the reference product approval, but keep in mind then you're going to run into issues where you need to get that authorization again, and that could then lead to potential delays. So really, you want to make sure that's really clinically appropriate to justify and argue for that reference product use, rather than delaying it further necessary if appropriate.
Yeah, I cannot reiterate that enough, because the most heartbreaking thing would be to lose a stable remission with mucosal healing because we're fighting for something that absolutely isn't indicated. And if we would have just made that switch, the worst thing to say is coulda, woulda, shoulda. So if it's absolutely not indicated, the worst thing is delays.
Great, thank you both. And Dr. Bhat, is there a biosimilar for Solera, and are you aware of any additional biologics that are in the biosimilar pipeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's currently 6 FDA-approved biosimilars for adalimumab or Humira at this time. Unfortunately, none of them are actually commercially available because all of them are currently undergoing patent lawsuits with the manufacturing company of Humira or AbbVie. So right now, there's just a lot of disputes going on that the biosimilar manufacturers need to resolve. It is estimated that these products will hopefully come into the market in 2023, potentially, and will be available for use by patients. So down the line, there's likely going to be biosimilars for Humira. As of right now, there's just some legal issues that need to kind of be worked out before they can get back onto the market. In terms of products in the pipeline, I know there's definitely some studies going on for Solera, so there's potential that there actually might be biosimilars for Solera coming out at some point as well.
At the end of the day, if you're on any medicine that ends with the letters MAB, there will be a biosimilar for it. And so the thing about it is it's just a brand new concept. And once we're all much more familiar and much more comfortable with the concept, it won't bother us so much. It's just something new, just like COVID was something new and we had to adapt. Now it's X number of years in and we're like, who cares? We're all wearing masks. We're fine. And so biosimilars are just going to be part of our routine pharmacy toolkit moving forward. And so there will be biosimilars for pretty much everything, just like there will be generics for pretty much everything.
Great. And then Dr. Ha or Dr. Bhat, if the biosimilars have the same active ingredients but are different, how are we sure that they will work the same way as the reference product?
So, I think that we have to rely on the fact that there's ample clinical evidence. And, I didn't highlight all the clinical studies that have been performed in Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, looking at the anti-TNFs. But what's reassuring is that they are all showing the same thing. Different study designs, different patient populations, different disease states. They're not showing differences in terms of effectiveness, safety, immunogenicity, and drug levels. So the levels are the same, the monitoring is the same, the likelihood of forming antibodies are the same. So that's what's reassuring, is that there's ample evidence. You don't get that with generics, but because we have so much data with biosimilars, I personally feel a lot more comfortable using them.
Yeah, I can tell you initially too that when the biosimilars came out, like that was the gastroenterologist actually had initial concerns with this medicine because the extrapolation process was concerning, and that rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis are actually different conditions in some capacity. And so how is it okay to just extrapolate? And because of that concern, there's been numerous trials that have been done now, and so many reassuring studies showing that there's nothing to really legitimately worry about. The other thing that I would like to highlight, and I don't think we have brought up yet, is that keep in mind that the average life cycle for Infliximab can vary per patient, right? It's not a medication that some patients actually have great luck with it and they're on it for 10 plus years, other patients 2 years, and then it stops working. Switching to a biosimilar in that process doesn't necessarily mean if it's down the line you lose effect to that biosimilar, it doesn't mean that the biosimilar is ineffective. It just means that you've lost response to Infliximab, that active ingredient. And so I think it's important to recognize that also when you talk about potential side effects and response to medicine. Keep in mind that, again, it's not the biosimilar switch that led you to lose response. If you do lose response over time, it's just a natural course of being on the medication. And the active ingredient itself, which again is the Infliximab.
Yeah, and that's an incredibly important point. And in addition to that, again, I love that that beer analogy that you made, Shubha, because even with the reference products for Infliximab and adalimumab, there are batch-to-batch variations. So the Infliximab you had last month is not likely the same Infliximab that you're getting 8 weeks later. And we even know with adalimumab, they made a switch in their recipe, right? A few years ago, they took out something and then changed something else, and there was no difference in its effectiveness. So that's it's not the same thing, but it's almost similar. There are changes that are always occurring within medications, and we're not seeing a lot of differences.
And one thing to also notice that when they make these changes, like each batch is analyzed. It's not just a batch that's made and sent out and good luck and hope that it's the same thing. So each batch is analyzed, everything undergoes a scrutiny process, and everything is being assessed quality control wise.
Great. And actually on that topic, Dr. Bhat, how do we know that the manufacturing facilities are at the same quality control as the reference biologics?
You're asking how we know that it contains the same active ingredient as the biologic? Yeah. So basically, again, because it gets FDA approved on the condition that it basically has biosimilarity properties. So again, it's showing that it has the same active ingredient, has the same pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic profile, it's hitting the same receptors, same mechanism of action. So all of that has to be proven before the FDA will even consider granting approval. Then once it undergoes a manufacturing process, so the biosimilar manufacturer has a recipe that they follow. They'll produce it using the same biologic process that we had talked about. So again, they have to splice the vector, they have to then put it into a cell line, they manufacture that cell line, and then they're able to produce the product. So it still undergoes that same concept. And then every product or every batch will undergo quality assurance control to make sure that it actually contains that same ingredient and contains the same amount of active ingredients and inactive ingredients, that it's as close as possible as to what the approved batch should be.
So Shubha, can I ask you a provocative question? This is a leading question. And so how would you compare the monitoring, the regulation of a biosimilar manufacturing process compared to herbal therapies, supplements, or things that you get over that, you wake up in the middle of the night and says, oh, you can lose 30 pounds by taking this supplement.
Yeah, so that's a valid point. So keep in mind, herbal products are not FDA approved at all. They're not FDA regulated at all. One of the issues that we generally tend to have with herbal products is that whatever is on the label does not actually have to match what's in the bottle or what's actually listed in the ingredients. So they could be saying that you're getting like apple cider vinegar, and then they could be putting like horseradish or some other stuff into that thing. So you're not even like, there's no regulation whatsoever.
But they can't say that for biosimilars, right? Biosimilars, it has to be what they say it is.
Yeah, but they undergo an FDA process, so it's not like they can just put whatever they want in that medicine. They have to, again, or they have to demonstrate that the recipe is similar to what the biologic reference product is. And then when they manufacture it, it's undergoing a rigorous approval process to make sure that it's exactly what they promised that it should be.
Great. And then Dr. Ha, can patients go back and forth between biologic and biosimilar depending on availability? So not necessarily pharmaceutical availability, but provider availability.
Yeah, so that's the question of multiple switches. So can you go from one reference to a biosimilar back to a reference to or even from a biosimilar to a biosimilar? That's an area that's still undergoing some investigation, but there actually have been some studies that have looked at not only just one switch, but multiple switches. And some of our colleagues at the VA have actually shown that you can have multiple switches because the same active ingredient is in place, the same rigorous manufacturing standards that Shubha just outlined for us are in place, that you should be able to make those multiple switches. There's more data, more robust data in psoriasis, and I believe in some of the rheumatologic conditions, but we will have that for Crohn's and colitis as well. One of the major clinical trials that is actually happening for one of the biosimilars to adalimumab is looking at this question of multiple switches, and thus far it appears to be just as safe and effective. Shubha, what are your thoughts on multiple switches?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the main concern, again, when we talk about multiple switching, is that immunogenicity risk. So again, when we ever talk about anti-TNF biologics, that's always a main concern that gastroenterologists and their team have in terms of, but we know that you can develop antibodies to these medicines, again, just because of the molecular complexity of these medicines. And so that's kind of where the main concern honestly comes with switching, is that it's not going to put you at risk of developing antibodies because we keep changing these products around. But again, because the active ingredient is the same, it's still Infliximab, it's really the studies that are proving to be reassuring in that sense. But again, I think more data is needed before we start to integrate that more routinely into our practice. However, insurance-wise, it's probably a situation that's going to start coming up more often, unfortunately, as these payers jump around and adopt different products under the formulary.
Great. And then Dr. Bhat or Dr. Ha, will the reference drugs, in your opinion, be phased out eventually, or will they just adjust to match the competition?
What do you think, Shubha?
What was the question again?
Is branded product ultimately going to be phased out?
So I think that's the goal. That's ultimately what we're hoping. We're hoping that, down the line, the biosimilars are the ones that are 100% adopted and become the mainstay treatment. If we have a little bit more time and we can talk about the insurance complexities, I can tell you that more likely than not, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Insurance processes are a little complicated in how they decide what they want on their formulary. And as long as the manufacturer of the brand or the reference product stay around, then they're likely going to have more leeway in influencing that the brand sometimes becomes the preferred or the main medication. So it's probably unlikely anytime soon that these reference products are going to be phased out. I think the ultimate goal is that we obviously would like for biosimilars to take away. Again, the main point is that not only are we hoping to drive down costs, but more importantly, what we know is so instrumental to our IBD population is that we need more treatment options. Mm-hmm. And the way that's going to happen is that we have money to do research and we have money to develop these drugs. And so by using biosimilars, if we're able to effectively adopt that and have the majority of our patients on that, then we have that money to do that. And that's really what we really need. We need more treatment options.
Exactly. And that's what I was going to reiterate too, is, from from a big picture standpoint, if it allows the possibility for pharmaceutical companies who are making these reference products to start focusing on new and other innovative other mechanisms to effectively treat Crohn's and colitis, the better. If they put, if they rest all their laurels on, I have a great product, I have no competition, why should I innovate? And so if anything, the cynic in me hopes that biosimilars will help continue to drive innovation, because as Shubha said, we need better treatments, we need more effective treatments, we need more options, because you don't want to be in a situation where you've already gone through everything and you have nothing left.
Great. So as we wrap up today's webinar, I think this is a very important point to reiterate. So do biosimilars differ, in dose and frequency compared to the original biologic?
Exact same. So whatever you were on before, just make sure that you're getting it again, and make sure that when your provider is getting the authorization for the biosimilar, that it's the same dose and the same interval that you've had that you've been on previously. Some insurers may forget or may not be aware that you were already on that medication. So it's very important to make sure that you're getting the exact same dose and interval.
And also to make sure that you sign up for the right copay assistance program. I can't tell you how many patients that have switched biosimilars and they completely forget about that copay assistance program, but they're not even aware of it. And then they get a bill again and it's back to that normal cost that they were paying before. And it's like, wait, hold up. I thought biosimilars were actually supposed to be cheaper, but they were paying $5 for the reference product. So again, keep that in mind that if you do get switched, make sure that you Google like whatever that biosimilar name is, that branded name for that biosimilar, that trade name. Google it and then type copay assistance, and you should find the right program to sign up for.
Before your first infusion, it's so hard to get that money back retroactively.
Well, thank you both. That was a lot of great information that you both shared throughout this evening. And once again, thank you to our expert faculty for sharing, your knowledge with our audience today and answering all the questions. Before we end the evening, I want to remind everyone to please fill out the evaluation survey that will be available for tonight's program. We really appreciate the feedback and it will help us plan future programming. And I'm going to pass it back to Alyssa to wrap up for the evening.
Thank you, Parsa, for moderating. Thank you, Dr. Bhat. Thank you, Dr. Ha. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. Before we say officially good night, we want to make sure you have an opportunity to view your local chapter's upcoming events on either the website or on their social media page. We'd love you to get involved in your local area. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Gilead, Janssen, Takeda, and Bristol Myers Squibb for their support of this MyIBD Learning webinar series. We hope to see you on our next webinar, which is next month, October 21st, which is on ostomy tips and tricks. Thank you again and have a great evening. Good night.